Hello and welcome to episode 321 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me is my abbreviated resume co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody. How are
Hey,
you
Seth.
this fine morning, Bill?
Doing great, Seth. And as we record this, we just passed a new milestone. Of course, will it be a month past the milestone when it airs? We passed 4 million YouTube views and I think another 700,000 audio listens, although that's less precise than YouTube. So again, want to thank all of our viewers and listeners. This would not, we wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for all of you guys, because it wouldn't be worth the effort. But it's fantastic, and so glad we can get the word about these great World War II heroes out to our audience.
Absolutely. And if you're watching now, you probably recognize a familiar face whom you haven't seen in quite some time. 11 months to be exact. I just looked it up on my phone, and that is the one and only Dave Holland. Dave, how are you this fine January morning or afternoon, I guess? Morning for you.
It's nice and warm in Australia. And thanks again. Let me be here with you guys. I'm a canal guy, as we know, Guadalcanal guy, but I know the 1st Marine Division well and its progression to Peleliu. I'm looking really forward to this talk. And I'm glad you told me that I'm on camera then, because I thought you were talking. I was off camera. I was going to start scratching my nose and picking my hair. And I was, oh, I'm on. So better be squared away
Yeah.
and look
So those
proper.
of you who don't remember our Guadalcanal accents won't remember Dave's confused Al-Australian accent, right? Alabama Australian. And Dave is in Australia. And we're really grateful for him waking up really early to be with us this morning, his time. Middle of
Zero
summer there,
six.
right, Dave?
Oh yeah, it's summer. It's nice and warm. Oh, I live in
Yeah.
Canberra, which is up kind of up in a mountain, so it's cool. But nowhere like the U.S. right now. I'm seeing these temperatures. I think like negative. I think my mother told me in Alabama that there was -5 wind chill
Yeah,
factor
Mhm.
Fahrenheit.
yeah,
It's crazy.
yeah. It
And
it
then the
it
next day
has
it's 70
been
degrees.
it has been brutally cold the last, I'd say, 2 weeks. It's actually relatively warm. It's relatively warm today, in that it's about 60 something here. But there's another front coming through on Friday, so it'll chill back down here in the deep
So
south. Not
72 degrees here in Florida there, Seth. I know you, I'm not going to get any sympathy from you, but it is
mm,
wonderful.
no, no, you won't, Bill. You will not at all. Last week when we recorded, I think you said it was 73, and it was
Exactly.
19 here, which is
All right.
damn cold. But anyway, let's get started. Before we get started, we want to ask you to like and subscribe to our channel, as it helps others find our show. We want to get the history to the masses. So if you haven't done so, please do so. And if you have done so, thank you very much. So D-Day at Peleliu was a bloodbath, to put it simply. The invasion, which was supposed to be, quote, tough but a quickie, was proving to be anything but. 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu amidst a hailstorm of Japanese fire. Mortar and artillery fire churned the water into a froth as the LVTs filled with Marines approached the shore. Japanese machine gun bullets dropped like rain in the lagoon as the Marines disembarked from their landing craft. The enemy fire was intense, far more intense than had been expected by any pre-invasion planning party. Casualties amongst the Marines, especially Chesty Puller's 1st Marine Regiment, had been heartbreakingly high. More than 1,100 Marines and Navy corpsmen were casualties on Peleliu's first day, with over 500 of those casualties coming from the 1st Marines alone. As dawn broke on day 2 at Peleliu, the going didn't get any easier. One of Puller's companies, K31, led by the indomitable George Hunt, was still isolated at the point. Down to 18 men, the company had fought off an all-night Japanese assault that left the surviving Marines barely able to function. The 5th Marine sat poised to strike across Peleliu's airfield and what would be called by some survivors as, quote, our Omaha Beach, unquote. And as if that weren't enough, the biggest obstacle of them all, the Umurbrogol, loomed in front of them like some mythical fortress, honeycombed with caves, ravines, and death for far too many Marines from the old breed. Now, guys, Dave, you weren't with us for our first episode on Peleliu, but you know how the story goes. D-Day was a a mess, to put it bluntly. The Marines did make some progress inland and were set poised on the edge of the airfield. And as we all know, the airfield was the major prize. Of course, you had to wipe out everybody on Peleliu, but the airfield was the major prize. And the 5th Marines, their task for this very day, which is D+1, is to take that airfield. But that airfield, if you look at a map, Bill, I don't know if you have the maps ready to roll, but if you look at the map of Peleliu, that section of Peleliu where the airfield lies is about the only flat ground. Can you pull that up for us, Bill, and let us see it?
Yeah, it's right there. So here's hopefully you can see it. Here's the airfield, and you're right. This area here is kind of plain, but then the Umurbrogol mountain range here is going to wreak terror on mostly the 1st Marine Regiment, the old breed that Dave is an expert on.
Yeah, one of the things that is very steeped in Peleliu lore is the heat and the lack of water. Dave, we all have experience in this in some way, shape, or form, but lay it on us. What was the situation, the supply situation, specifically water, and in terms of weather, looking like with the 5th, with all the Marines, but specifically the 5th Marines on the edge of that airfield?
The weather, I mean, we're talking, I think I read somewhere, some of the hottest ever experienced by U.S. soldiers in apart from the desert in World War II. So we're looking at 110, 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Basically, these guys were caught out, no cover, in the open, combat conditions. So that in itself, you're pumping out a lot of sweat and doing a lot of work. So they landed with 2 canteens of water. That was a standard assault rig out, 2 canteens of water. But when the dawn broke, you can imagine after the first day of hard fighting, you have no water.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys are pretty good water discipline, especially that 1/3 had been on Guadalcanal, and the 2/3 had been in Cape Gloucester. So the thing you'll read about with the 1st Marine Division, with their NCOs, especially on Guadalcanal and when it went into Gloucester, was the water discipline. They keep talking about these new guys. They don't know water discipline. They'll drink all the water in the first hour or two. Conserve your water, conserve your water. So even in considering that, by the 2nd day, I'd say most of these guys didn't have much water.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it sounds bad, but they were taking water from the dead. There was obviously, you need water. You see a couple of dead guys there, you're going to grab the water. And I read one account where they're searching Japanese bodies, not for souvenirs as Marines normally do in those days, and they were looking for water. So it just shows how desperate they were. So they were already dehydrated and suffering from heat casualties. And I don't know, Bill, if you in your service you've seen heat casualties, but you can go down very quickly. I mean, put it some of the listeners and viewers out there. Imagine in the South going to football practice in the summer without water. It sucks it out of you. So I think it goes back to the point shown in the Pacific series, and you speak to most of the veterans of those days. And it wasn't just on Peleliu, but they stored the water in these 55-gallon or 40-liter for my Australian viewers. I have to do a conversion. Gallon or fuel cans. And I think most of the people not even familiar with Peleliu, even watch this series, know these fuel cans have to be properly sanitized. So back at Pavuvu in the rear rest area, they had working parties. And I've been on several working parties myself. And basically that's where an NCO walks around, finds enlisted Marines and says, you need to work. There's a whole science about trying to get away from working parties. And the Marines, they call it skating to get away, to hide. I mean, I know guys used to hide under their racks so that the sergeants couldn't find them. You can see sometimes on these working parties, they didn't want to be there. They're not that enthused, and they didn't do that good of a job. And even if they did, you're still going to get some of the petroleum products leaking out of those cans. Hence, when they opened these fuel cans up, it was a good idea because they built them so they could roll them off the ships very quickly. They opened them up, they couldn't drink it because as soon as they opened a lot of these up, you just had a layer of the skim of petroleum product on top, whether it's gasoline or almost said petrol. Sorry, petrol, gasoline, or diesel. Some of the Marines tried to drink it, but they became immediately sick and vomited. There was one veteran, PFC Bill Layden of K35. He found a hole filled with khaki-colored water, filled with dead insects. Instead of drinking this water, he said, "I'll take the next best thing," and he went in to drink out of these mud holes, basically. And the water-starved Marines, they filled their helmets with this basically muddy water and gulped it down, adding to the misery. Another veteran, Eugene Sledge, watched some Marines puke as he drank the water and declined to consume the helmet full, and he grabbed himself. Sterling Mace, also from K35, later said, quote, "When I tasted the water from the oil barrels, I was glad I still had some from that mud hole. If you had to make a choice, Coral Grit goes down better than gasoline any day," unquote.
Very, very, very true. Sterling Mace, to my knowledge, I knew Sterl very well. Sterling Mace is still alive. He's one of the few K-35 veterans from Peleliu and Okinawa that's still kicking. He lived, and when I knew him, in St. Pete Beach, Florida. Rather irrepressible young man at that time from Queens, New York. He was a hell of a guy. Bill, even the water is a significant issue. The heat is a significant issue for the Marines on Peleliu, but there was more of an issue than even water and the heat, and that is basically their objective. 5th Marines' objective for that day, or really for that part of the campaign, is that airfield. And this is, as we said, it's the only real flat piece of ground on Peleliu, and that's going to be a tough nut to crack for these guys.
Yeah, it is. The water is bad. The Japanese are worse. And one of the things I want to say here, Seth, is that the miniseries that you had something to do with the Pacific really portrays both the water issues and this assault on the airfield very, very well. The mission was fairly simple. Move across the airfield with all haste, occupy enemy positions on the opposite side, and then move to the high ground. It sounds simple, extremely difficult to execute in the face of the enemy. There was no cover to speak of across the airfield. The smashed Japanese buildings on the other side were where men would naturally gather once across, but the Marines would be under direct fire from the high ground the entire way across. At 0800, 3 battalions from 5th Marines would jump off and get across the airfield. Anyway, that was the plan. 5th Marines would be supplemented by 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, who would take the northern portion of the airfield. And again, let's see if I can pull that map up here. I think I can. So here's the 5th Marines in the middle, assaulting the airfield. 1st Marines are to the north. They're supposed to take the northern part of the airfield right up here. And remember, that's Chesty Puller's regiment. We'll talk about him more later. So that's the plan. The assault would then turn toward northeast, pivoting on the extreme left of 1st Marines. At least that was the plan. Nervous at the thought, the Marines knew they would take a pounding. And as the day before, on D-Day, the Japanese, in their tank and infantry counterattack, had come across that same airfield and had been pounding by the 5th Marines. Now, on the receiving end, the men were anxious to get moving because they thought the quicker they could get across this airfield, the less punishment they would receive, Seth. But that's not the way it worked out.
No, not at all. And I mean, again, you got to emphasize the flat ground on the airfield here, because as we're going to see as we get in deeper into this episode, that's it. Because we're going to get up into the Umurbrogol, we're going to get up into the mountains, and I say mountains, the mountain. And this is the one area where there can be potentially a quick advance. Here is that airfield. So, talking about 3-5, we didn't really mention them too much in the first episode. We're going to hit a lot on them today and our next episode when we talk about them too. They were not unlike any of the other battalions in the 1st Division. They were veterans of one or two, at the very least one campaign, either Guadalcanal or Cape Gloucester or both. Those veterans made up about 65 to 70% of the rifle companies. The remainder, as we said before, were fresh boots, guys like Gene Sledge, guys who had, or Bill Layden even for that matter, who had not seen any combat to this point. K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines was a perfect example of that veteran-infused, boot-infused rifle company within the 1st Marine Division that we talked about so much last week, Bill. They were led by a hardened combat veteran, Captain Andrew A. Haldane, known by his code name of Close Crop because of his hair, or Ack Ack as Andrew A. King Company, as it was called, was finely tuned machine. Haldane was a Massachusetts native and a graduate of Maine's Bowdoin College. I'm sorry. Among his classmates of 1941 was another Marine whom you're going to hear about in this episode, one Everett P. Pope, who was also a fellow company commander in C, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. Haldane was
Seth,
typical of, yes,
that's Bowdoin College of Joshua Chamberlain fame, right?
indeed it is. Indeed it is.
Yeah. So they had a lot to live up to here. No Little Round Top, though.
Yeah, this is kind of the 1st Marine, the 5th Marine's Little Round Top, if you want to say it.
Yeah.
It's no walk in the park, shall we say. But getting back to Andy Haldane, he was typical of most company CEOs that populated the old breed, as we were saying. He was a graduate of OCS in 1942. He saw action on Guadalcanal and became CEO of K-35 at Cape Gloucester, where he received a Silver Star for the vicious combat at Waltz Ridge. And Bill, we talked about that when we did our episode on Gloucester. The fight at Waltz Ridge by 3-5 was nasty, nasty, nasty.
Yep.
At 27 years old, Haldane was a fatherly figure to his men, if you can believe that. 27 years old, and you're the old man in the company. He was known to never raise his voice to an enlisted man. He was an easygoing guy who led his men by example, as all good leaders do, often encouraging his Marines to write their mothers and keep themselves out of unnecessary risk. He was absolutely loved by every man who populated K-35. And Bill, you've said this before, and Dave, I know you can chime in here too, that when you've got a good company commander or executive officer or whatever the case may be, it's not uncommon to say he was loved by his men. But that's very, very true, though. I mean, in both of your experiences, that is a very true statement.
Yeah, from what I've read and some of the guys have actually I spoke to it and knew him. Yeah, they would have loved him, respected him. And for some of these young 18, 19-year-old guys, he's almost probably like wasn't so much a father, but like a very respected uncle, so to speak. He provided the leadership there these guys have needed, and they look far up to him. And a guidance. Yeah.
So,
yeah. And Dave, there's another scene from the Pacific that comes to mind here, and has something to do with this gunnery sergeant. Do you know who I'm talking about?
So I can talk about him.
Go for it.
So, Elmo, nicknamed Pop Haney, or Saint Elmo, actually. I've got his service record book all the way from 1917 when he joined the Marine Corps. I've got his service record book, and through that is just amazing. I'd love to share I'll send it to you after this, Seth. He wrote, so this guy, before I really get into him, in 1941, when the war kicked off, this has been early 42. So after the war kicked off of December 41, Haney was sent to South America with a number of other Marines, kind of like a Marine Embassy Guard duties, probably how you equate it today. But he didn't want to be there. He wanted to fight. So Haney was a bit of an eccentric fellow. So he sent a letter directly to the President of the United States. And in this letter, I won't say exact words he did, but he basically said he's down there amongst a bunch of whoremongering, drinking people, that he's a fighter and they're doing nothing but guarding diplomats. And he goes on and on and on. This is directly to the FDR. Obviously, it didn't get to FDR. It got intercepted, thank goodness, in the chain of command. But he said, I just want to fight. And it did right after that. And I've actually read the corresponding letter when it went up the chain of command, the notes that the officer took. He said, yeah, I think people knew of Haney. But Haney, he went to K-35 in early 41, and he was one of the regional members of K-35, apparently. But I read that and I thought, this can't be true, because I've looked at his service record book, and I've read a few books. He was a member of K-35. Because if you were to tell me 7th Marines, yes, they were formed in January 41. But the 5th Marines had been there for a long time. They were the original unit, the 1st Marine Brigade that morphed into the division. But anyway, he was one of the early members before they deployed to Guadalcanal. So he joined the Marine Corps in 1917, but he missed the war. Like a lot of the Marines did that time. He was serving on ship duty, or some of the guys with the Dominican Republic and other areas. So he missed the war. He didn't actually fight over in France. But he was a Banana War Marine, so there was the Banana Wars, and I'll refer to it a bit later in the podcast too, in the episode. That was the wars fought in the 20s and 30s in Haiti and Nicaragua. But he did his time there. He did a typical Marine Corps before the war tour. Then he went, I think he actually did some China time. I have to double check. So he did some time in China Marine. So he got around. Anyway, he was 46. Yeah, 46, roughly around that time. So he served on Guadalcanal, served on Gloucester, actually earned a Silver Star on Gloucester. And I've got a good photo of him get presented the Silver Star. It was a bit eccentric. I think any of the viewers that watched the Pacific series show some of his eccentric behavior. Apparently, he was known to clean himself in the showers with a stiff brush. And if you go into the books or go into the series, how he cleaned himself and which certain body parts, how he cleaned it with supposed to be a steel brush and his I know we're family friendly, but I'll use a technical term. Well, I won't use a Marine term. I'll say testicles. He scrubbed his testicles with a wire brush. Sometimes how these things, legends get built up. He was probably just scrubbing his back probably brushing his teeth, and it just morphed into that. Marines just telling stories. But once again, in the Pacific, and that was based on you probably know Seth. He was running a shooting range, and a boot lieutenant had a safety breach. Yeah, I don't know if he hit him in the side of the head, but yeah, he got up him pretty quick, or got onto him. So he's actually in a Collier's magazine article, and I'll quote what the article says in 1942, how they described him. So this kind of sums him up. He was, quote, he is past 46. I think he wasn't in his 50s yet. I think he's about 48. I have to double check. Sorry. So he's, quote, past 46, a leathery little man, a stickler for discipline, as rigid as a ramrod, a man who knows the book backwards, a sun-dried little man, as hard as hobnails, with more battles under his belt than most Marines have years of service, unquote. So that was a very good description.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably pretty accurate too, and that he long since deceased when the interviews of these guys were being conducted. But he even then was still, I'm talking like in 06 and before, he was even then revered by these guys for his leadership. He was, the First Marine Division is called the Old Breed, and Pop Haney was the Old Breed. He was that old Marine that was just, your typical, prototypical, ramrod straight, hard as nails, hard as woodpecker lips Marine. It
would have been tough.
Mm-hmm.
Especially go through.
Seth, I remember that scene in the Pacific with him stripping down and when it started raining and scrubbing up and swearing at God when the rain stopped because he hadn't rinsed off yet.
Yes.
Supposedly, a good Australian actor too. Gary Sweet, I think, played him. He's a very well-known Australian actor. Played a lot of good parts.
So supposedly that is true. As you say, legends do get built, but supposedly that, that was a regular occurrence with him. And he would also conduct bayonet drill by himself. He would, I guess, shadow box with bayonets, but regardless, he was an eccentric character, but he's one of those guys that filled the ranks, not just of K Company, but of all the Marine battalions and regiments within the First Marine Division. And there were veterans like him and Hal Dane and guys that you've heard of like Hillbilly Jones and Richard Higgins. They dotted the muster list, but guys that were boots like Bill Layden, we mentioned him before, and of course, Eugene Sledge, helped fill the ranks. Layden was from Long Island, New York. He was a feisty little, stocky little guy. He was foul-mouthed, and I cuss, but he could make me blush. He was always looking for a fight, and he fit in perfectly with the veteran riflemen in K Company. Of course, the most famous member of K Company we got to talk about is Eugene Sledge from your native state, Dave, of Alabama. Gene was from Mobile. He was another boot. He absolutely idolized the veterans in K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th, and he was very lucky enough to be stuck in my old buddy's squad, RV Bergen's mortar squad, which was filled with veterans like Bergen, Muriel Shelton, among others. Sledge, of course, kept an illegal diary in the pages of his New Testament that, of course, he used to write probably the greatest first person account of fighting ever written by an enlisted man, which of course is with the old breed from Peleliu to Okinawa. Now, as we're getting ready to kick off this fight here across this airfield, these guys, Bill, they're lying in their shell craters, and they're preparing for this assault. Tell us how this assault goes down. They receive Japanese artillery before they ever even move out, right?
Yeah, they did. It started, in front of their positions, and they were ranging men. So the artillery fire began to creep towards them. American artillery responded, including naval gunfire being the loudest. But the Navy and the 11th Marines provided a walking barrage that started mid-airfield and walked towards the Japanese positions on the other end, culminating in a massive barrage on those precisions. Then, exactly at 8 o'clock, just as planned, Marine officers stood up and yelled, "Let's go." The men, all 4,500 of them, 4,500 at this point in time, got up and began moving across the airfield at a slow walk and then a trot. And then after about 200 yards, the Japanese opened fire from the high ground, causing the Marines to break into full sprint across the airfield. The fire grew in intensity as the Marines moved further, with rifle fire shots zipping past the Marines. One 19-year-old recalled, "You could hear a shot, plop." And of course, the plop was a bullet going through a body. With no place to hide the Marines, the only place there was to go was forward. The Japanese artillery tore into the Marines, and calls for corpsmen were ignored. Nobody had any idea except to survive. They were running. They just wanted to live at this point, just trying to keep moving. Gene Sledge remembered the charge across the airfield as the most terrifying ordeal on Peleliu. Sledge put his faith in the man upstairs and kept repeating to himself Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want." Sledge made it across the survivors of K-35, who were at this point visibly shaken. And Seth, I got to tell you that Psalm 23 is a very dear spot in my heart for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which is my old buddy, L.D. Cox, survivor of the USS Indianapolis. I was visiting him while he was on his deathbed, and L.D. Cox had me read Psalm 23 to him. I'm guessing 30 or 40 times while he was on his deathbed. So every time I hear Psalm 23, I can't help but get emotional over it.
Yeah, I mean, you can understand why, as you're going through, and this is not Sledge's first combat experience. His first combat experience was the day before, but even after all those years, he remembered this as being his most terrifying time in combat, was running across that airfield. And if you look at pictures of the attack, which I'll show now, I mean, there is literally no place for these guys to hide. I mean, you see a couple of wrecked Japanese aircraft and maybe a vehicle or two, and that is it. Other than that, it is as flat as a pancake and as wide open as you could possibly imagine it to be. And there's a reason that the survivors, of which, they were significantly less than those who started out, called it our Omaha Beach, because those guys were in a shooting gallery the whole way across. But Dave, once they get across over there, once they get across the airfield, that's not it. The fight is not over by any means. There's still got a lot of Japanese to knock out over there, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was just getting across no man's land, so to speak. Actually, I was reading one account where a Marine thought it said it looked like a movie, a World War I movie. He said when they were running over he looked left and right, and it looked like something out of World War I over the top. So yeah, once they had to go across the danger area, then they had to actually close with and destroy, is what a Marine infantry squad does, the enemy, which in this case is the Japanese. The Japanese had, I think you haven't. It's on your photo. Do you have that little skeletal remains of these hangars? Because they built them pre-war. That was the concrete. The thing you guys discussed it maybe in your last episode, how they built this up pre-war. There's a Japanese possession, so these reinforced concrete hangars. And I think in the Pacific too, they showed a good representation of one of those buildings. But so the Japanese were in these things, and once again, you got to remember they withstood the naval bombardments. I know you guys talked about that last week, so I won't get into that now. What the potential lack of, but don't get me on that sidetrack. So these first guys across, they didn't have their normal corkscrew and blowtorch demolition tactics, or equipment with them. So like their C4 and their demolition charges and the bazookas. The first guys didn't have them. So the first guys, what do you think they had? They had rifles and bayonets and machine guns. So they had to get these Japanese out of these fixed positions. So they had grenades and their small arms. So basically, it was hand-to-hand, slow, methodical type fighting. And then once again, I guess you could say, quote, the cavalry arrived with the Shermans, the tank support they had. I don't know why the tanks didn't go forward, and it was a combined infantry attack with the tanks. But the tanks, I guess, there were a few tanks, and they probably did provide cover or provide support to some branch. And then once they started getting, I guess, defensive fire from another section, they diverted those tanks to say, look, we got some nuts to crack over here, and they probably brought some tank support up then. So then it was hand to hand and basically blasting these Japanese out of emplacements. And once the Shermans come up with their 75s, they were hitting them point blank. And once they destroyed those Japanese positions, then the Marines could move forward past those initial defensive positions around the airfield.
Yeah, the tanks definitely added some oomph to the attack for sure, because just like you said, most of the guys, once they got across there, they did not have the demo weapons that they needed at that point. That's not to say that they weren't there, but by and large, they didn't have everything they needed. The tanks really provided that power to get through those last bit of defenses right there. And once they were done that portion, they skirted along the northern edge of the airfield. Chesty Puller's 2nd Battalion 1st ran into stiff, and I do mean stiff, enemy resistance amid the rubble of aircraft hangars and storage buildings over on the other side. Making use of the ruins as improvised fighting positions, the Japanese often fought stubbornly, no surprise here, and slowed down the Marine advance. Chesty Puller's 2-1 fights into the afternoon before it clears those ruins and takes up new positions on the island's main thoroughfare, which is the East Road. Casualties amongst the attackers, the Marines, of course, were very heavy. At 10:18, Bucky Harris, who's CO of 5th Marines, receives a message from 1-5 requesting reinforcements. A Company 1st Battalion 5th had 90 effectives left, and B and C were not much better. Total casualties for the assault vary, but estimates put the Marine casualties in the charge across the airfield alone and the fighting on the other side at about 300 men in the 5th Marines alone. So it was, every bit as nasty and bloody as those guys had feared once they got across. But the key point here is that they do get across, they do clear those buildings, and as something you're going to see as we go through these Peleliu episodes, they do it fast, and the positions are cleared quickly, and the Japanese are eliminated quickly, which is something you're not going to see for the remainder of the campaign as we get up into the hills. And key point here also is that by capturing this airfield, it allowed Marine Corsairs to move into the region here pretty soon. I don't remember the exact date that they got VMF 114 down there, but it wasn't about a week later, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more than that, that the Corsairs do come in there and they start providing, there's really famous footage of these Corsairs taking off from the field with their landing gear still down, dropping napalm on the Umurbrogol, which is literally at the end of the damn airstrip right there. They called it the shortest bombing run of the war. Take off, drop, turn around, land, and do it again. But that air support really brings another aspect of the fight to the Marine side, and I think it comes about a week later. Now, guys, while the 5th Marines took the airfield along with 2nd Battalion 1st, the 7th Marines had been making slow but steady progress up Peleliu's eastern shore. Bill, if you can bring the map up, you can show us where these guys are looking at right about now.
Yeah, the 7th came ashore to the south here, but then they cleared the areas. We talked about that last week, all the way to the south. But then they pivoted up, and they were supposed to go up the East Road. So that was the plan. And if anybody had it, I'm going to use the word easy, and it wasn't easy. It was the 7th Marines. They were able to get to some progress, but that progress did come to a sudden halt when they ran into a 40-foot diameter concrete blockhouse possessing 4-foot thick walls. The structure was bristling with machine guns and 20-millimeter cannons, and it was the strongest defensive work on the entire island. so the immense structure was immune to both flamethrowers and 75mm tank guns. And Marine infantry suffered badly during the repeated fruitless attacks. Engineers finally breached the blockhouse with a hefty charge of plastic explosives, and vengeful riflemen gunned down stunned Japanese that stumbled out of the structure. I Company 1st Battalion 7th Marines specifically claimed the blockhouse as their prize. And the 7th Marines by far had the easiest time, I said that, in the fight, but that's not to say it was a cakewalk, but their casualties had been significantly lighter, and the terrain in which they found themselves relatively flat and covered by scrub jungle foliage, something that the Marines were relatively familiar with, Seth.
Yeah. And Dave, going back to your Guadalcanal, experiences, and then, we know Cape Gloucester was a rainforest, literally tropical rainforest. This is terrain that the Marines are somewhat familiar with. And, we've made the comments on numerous episodes that terrain, is really the master of everything. And this is one of the examples that, even though you're facing a seemingly, impregnable fortress in this one blockhouse, the Marines are able to knock it out, mainly because of the fact that they can move around terrain that's familiar to them and execute the tactics that they know well.
So if you look at, I guess, starting from Guadalcanal to Cape Gloucester, just like you said, Seth, these guys are very familiar with the thick jungle. And also I've read somewhere in Peleliu, one of the books on Peleliu, and this is the Marines wasn't really had experience with caves and fixed positions. And I'll mention this now, because we're talking about it. That's not true. And just on Guadalcanal itself, look at day one on Tulagi, they were fighting for caves. Then the whole Point Cruz area, which a lot of people don't even know on Guadalcanal, that was just coral caves. They held the Marines up there for 6 weeks in fixed positions. So they had, the 1st Marine Division knew about, I guess you'd call it bunker busting. So they had experience on that. And then once again on Gloucester, they had a number of bunkers. They did run in some caves and some stuff on Gloucester too, as you guys talked about. One thing about, I'll mention, I was listening to you guys' episode last week about terrain. I'll just do a quick sidetrack. You got a minute or two here. So when I was in the Marine Corps, I remember more and more I read about this battle, I keep thinking about Iwo Jima. I said, this is like a mini Iwo Jima. The more I read about it, and all this, you guys are going to cover Iwo extensively in the future. But in 1989, I was in the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. So that's why I like reading about the 5th Marines. I was in 1-5, and we were in Okinawa on a deployment there. And I got picked for my battalion to go on a battlefield study tour of Iwo Jima. So I was there for 4 days. And my role in the Marine Corps at the time was a scout sniper. So my whole goal was actually in training was to identify terrain, to read terrain, to report back on terrain, and for reconnaissance type work. And I remember we went into one bunker. And when I was reading about Peleliu, I kept thinking back to that. And I go, man, this is just crazy. In one bunker, I don't know if the bunker's probably still there, but on the side of the wall was, and I recognize it because being a trained forward observer, you could just see things on the wall, and it had like little numbers and Japanese writing, but it had like, for example, I don't know what the numbers were, but alpha AB 1001 or AB 1002, and they had like a little part of it was still there. You had like a range chart and terrain chart, and it had like a little recess in the ground. It was right directly in front of them, and it had like 200 meters out, 100 meters, and basically what that was. And we had a colonel that was taking us around. He said that's their range. So that whole area was pre-registered, and that was the same way with Peleliu. That whole area was pre-registered, and I just kept. As more and more I read about Peleliu, I thought this is just like Iwo Jima. I mean, this is just like I don't know. And I remember on Iwo, I said if I ever found an Iwo veteran, I'd shake their hand, and I would say the same with Peleliu. After studying Peleliu a bit here, this is just what they had to go through. The defenses is unreal.
It was ungodly, the amount of preparation that the Japanese put into this defense of this island. And Nakagawa was an absolute master at defense. Colonel Nakagawa, he was a master at defense. And, as we'll see as we go through these episodes, the example that he puts forth here for the Japanese is followed very closely. as the rest of the Pacific War unfolds. Now, you know, there's some famous artwork, Bill, that came out of this event by a guy named Tom Lee. He was a Life magazine artist. Can you tell us a little bit about Tom Lee?
He had some incredible images
Yeah.
that he created out of this. And everybody knows the expression 1,000-meter stare. And I don't remember where that originated, but he had one piece of art that he created that was the 2,000-yard stare. And in it you could see a grizzled Marine with a dead look in his eyes, and probably a week's stubble on his face. He also did another image of a Marine actually in a boat going ashore from Peleliu. And I remember that one is noteworthy because the Marine has green camouflage paint on his face. And I think the first time I saw this Tom Lee image was the first time I ever realized that the Marines put camo paint on their face. Even then, at Peleliu, and of course, I'm sure, Dave, you knew about this, but the most famous one is that whiskery, red-eyed, dirty Marine who'd spent the night fighting in foxholes with the stinking swamp water, and he's slimy and mean. That's the way Tom Lee described him anyway. And passing by the blown-out blockhouse, Lee took note of the dead Japanese around him, writing, "There were dead Japanese on the ground where they had been hit. And in 2 pillboxes, I saw some of the bodies that were no more than red, raw meat and blood mixed up with the gravelly dust, concrete, and splintered logs." And it was just a horrific, hellacious scene that he both painted and described really well in his articles, Seth.
Yeah, and if you go back and there's several books written about Tom Lee, and I even think there's one by Tom Lee. I highly suggest you pick him up and look at some of his artwork, because Peleliu was not the only thing that he painted. He painted some stuff he was aboard the USS Hornet during the Battle of Santa Cruz and other places like that. But Peleliu is what he's most famous for, and highly suggest you take a look at some of his artwork if you haven't seen it. But he was attached to the 7th Marines, which is why we bring him up now. The 7th continued their advance in the south here. And by 1025, lead elements were within sight of their objective at the southeastern promontory. They, by far, with the exception of the 5th Marines taking the airfield on D+2 or D+1, the 7th Marines had made the most progress by far on Peleliu. 2 pillboxes defended the area, and by 1200, both of those pillboxes have been left in ruins thanks to naval gunfire and airstrikes, as we were talking about. These airstrikes, at this point, are coming from the aircraft carriers of the Big Blue Fleet. Shortly after lunch, the 7th had cut off the southern portion of Peleliu and would concentrate on killing what was left of the Japanese on that end. As stated before, casualties had been lightest in the 7th, but Peleliu's merciless heat that David alluded to before, 105 degrees in the shade, left the men dehydrated and spent, out of water. 3-7 urgently requested replenishment as men were, quote, out of water and having dry heaves, unquote. LVTs eventually did bring water to the men, who slurped it up as fast as they could. Now, we left off last week's episode, Bill, with the story of K Company 3rd Battalion 1st at the Point. The Point is that promontory that kind of sticks out in between there. There you go, right there. George Hunt's company had been whittled down to, virtually nothing by D+1, D+2. They were down to 18 men who could move and walk and pull a trigger, an entire company, when they landed with 235 guys. As dawn is breaking and the 5th Marines are making their attack across the airfield, K-31 still holds the point, albeit just barely. The Japanese had hit Hunt's men all night long, but the guys held. The Marines held, as I said, although down to 18 men. They did get some reinforcements earlier in that morning on D+1 via LVTs, and most of these guys, some of them were from K-31's 2nd Platoon that had gotten separated. Others were literally cooks, field music, whoever could pick up a rifle and move were put up in this line. Quote, George Hunt writes, tractors rolled up to us all day along the reef. They brought my mortar section with cloverleaf after cloverleaf of shells. They brought up an artillery observation team and a radio, finally, to communicate with the gun batteries, and the remaining 10 men from my second platoon, unquote. With the supply and reinforcement, Hunt allowed, quote, that it would be our turn to throw the heavy stuff, mortars and artillery. We had 7 machine guns on the line and 30 more men. Radios were working, and there were 2 telephone lines to battalion. For the first time since we landed, we felt secure, unquote. Now, you can't make light of this situation. And George Hunt in this fight for the point there on Peleliu, Dave, as a former 1st Marine Division grunt, this is a legendary story. These guys held out all night long. And when you talk about close combat, this was some close combat. I mean, literally, guys jumping on the backs of Marine, Japanese jumping on the backs of Marines as they're holding this point tenuously all night long. It's truly one of the legendary stories of not only Peleliu, but of the Pacific War. Can you enlighten us on some of the action that goes on down here?
So I think I read this, Carl Comes High?
Yep.
Very small book, but very good book. I mean, as you can tell from behind me, I've read a bit, and I've been a reader since I was a little kid. So I remember reading this in the Marines. In fact, it was on the Marines, one of the recommended, Commandant's recommended books on his list. I don't know if they still have it. I'm pretty sure they still have the Commandant's reading list. And it was one of them on there. I think a lot of guys actually read it because it was so small. You have to read X number of books, and Marines being Marines, I'll read that little one. But the little, it comes in, a lot of information comes in good packages. So it's actually a good book to read if you haven't read it, for the listeners and viewers. So once they felt secure, Captain Hunt felt strong enough to send a patrol out in front of his lines. And then patrol went out. Once again, the Japanese was there because they didn't have to go far, and they got a pretty good firefight. And it cost the lives of 3 men. I don't know how many was wounded. Had 3 KIA. The patrol leader reported back to Hunt, quote, "There's a mess of them in the caves. Take a hell of a lot of men to rout them out," unquote. And Hunt reported to the battalion commander there was still, quote, "plenty of Japs in front of us, seem to be gathering for something, maybe a night attack," unquote. So once again, they're gathering intel. They're getting ready. This is going to be a night attack. So correct me if I'm wrong here, Seth. They wasn't cut off completely here at this stage. I know they've been cut off earlier. Had they been
Correct.
opened up, like you said? Yeah. So they had a little bit of, I think from the beach, they had some of the small supply line, so they could evacuate some of the wounded to bring in supplies and a few other guys.
Right.
So, yep. So their reconnaissance and their information paid off. They prepped themselves up. The thing I was reading, you got 7 machine guns. So you got 7 machine guns in a small perimeter. That's a lot of firepower, the machine guns. So they might have just probably scavenged some machine guns off some Amtraks, or there's probably enough guns laying around. Because I think I think he lost his whole machine gun platoon. If I remember, on day 1, Hunt did, or day 2, most of the machine gun platoon. Yeah, in fact, on the beach, all the machine gun platoon was wiped out on the beach, he said. So there was probably plenty of guns laying around to grab. So around midnight, the Japanese hit K Company again, 3-1. So once again, they had a small perimeter, and basically was a carved out hole in a beach. One of these guys, Fred Fox. What rank was he, Seth? Do you remember?
He was a PFC. Yeah, Fred Fox. He was a grunt.
So PFC Fred Fox prepped himself for the fight. Hearing a noise in the water behind him, he immediately whirled around. He said, quote, "In turning, I hit a bayonet that had started into my chest and knocked it out of the way. It cut through my jacket and left a 4 inch by 1 inch half gash through the flesh of my left chest. I had a pistol in my hand. It was cocked and loaded, but I did not shoot the man. I hit him in the face with it as hard as I could. He immediately dropped the rifle, which I took and bayoneted him with. I pulled it out and started yelling, 'Nips, nips,' unquote." You could see that natural reaction. That's actually a good indication of how close combat was. Very scary to have that bayonet there, and it was just an instant reaction. Instead of shooting, he just reacted, body and hit him in the face with a pistol.
Yeah.
It's just instant reaction, reflex.
And Fred's position was at the edge of the line of K Company, and he literally was almost in the water. I mean, when he said he heard a noise in the water, he means he heard a noise in the water because it was like 10 feet behind him. I mean, he was damn near in the surf. when this is going on. The Japanese had tried to work themselves around. So, I mean, they were coming in from behind K Company's positions right there because they knew they had whittled these guys down. And to your point, Dave, you'd asked if they were cut off initially on day one. Yeah, obviously they were, but they did get some resupply. But to be clear, they were still the only guys up on that point. K Company 3rd Battalion 1st were the only cats on the Marines on the top of that point up there. They had received a few reinforcements here and there, and most importantly, ammunition, but they were the only living, breathing Marines on that point. So they hadn't received a whole hell of a lot of help. Once that attack hits Fred Fox, and he is the first guy that gets hit in that melee at night, it just erupts on the point again. Marines all around the point start yelling. The fight grows in intensity. Immediately, Hunt, sitting in the middle of all of his men, which is a good place for a company commander to be, recall, quote, "I bellowed until I thought my lungs would crack. Give them hell, kill every one of them," unquote. The Japanese were literally stampeding the Marines up on the front end of this line, but the Marines held. Unbelievably so, even though they're outnumbered probably close to 3-1, they hold out again through the night. At this time, which is something they did not have on the first night, they actually have Marine Corps artillery support. The Marine Corps artillery starts crashing in among the Japanese attackers, who are now lit by flares, wiping out many. As the flares begin to fall, and we've all seen flares at night, they do that ghostly, trickle as they drop down at night. Hunt says, quote, "Two figures, dim and queerly distorted in the battle fog, fought against each other on the crest of the cliff. Their arms were swinging wildly, their heads lowered and legs intertwined. The largest figure seemed to heave forward with his entire right side. The knees of the other bent back. He turned sideways and, losing his balance, tumbled off the cliff," unquote. So the fighting all along the point, literally in almost every single position, was hand to hand. The Japanese, as we said, Bill, they attempted to go around the left flank through the water's edge just below the cliff. And Fred Fox, my old buddy who got hurt in this fight, he's in trouble here, isn't he?
He is. He's caught between the enemy and his own men. And, in a second or two, there were, I think, another 2 or 3 Japanese he says, in a second or two, there were another 2 or 3 Japanese starting after me. Then there was an explosion, and I went down to the water, hit along the left side with 5 chunks of steel in my left leg and left arm, unquote. Another Japanese soldier bayoneted him in the neck and across the back and left him for dead. He said, "I lay quietly in the water. At certain times, I would look out of the corner of my eye to see if I could see anything, and I could see wrapped legs, right leggings, and split-toed shoes, knowing that it was the Japanese," unquote. Barely conscious, Fred Fox lay bleeding as the battle raged all around him. The guns fired across the water over him against the cliff, and he said, "This went on until sometime just before daylight." So he played dead until just before daylight. Then he yelled for help, and his calls for help were heard. A Marine left his position, worked his way over to the badly wounded man, and carried him to safety. It's amazing that he didn't give up hope, going through all of that with these serious wounds, waiting for somebody to rescue him.
Yeah, he was a plucky little dude. He returned to Peleliu in the 90s. And if you refer back to our first episode, last week's episode we did about Peleliu and talked about the point, we mentioned Fred. And he was a flamethrower man, but he didn't have his flamethrower. Either, I can't remember if it was defective or if he lost it going ashore. He just didn't have it. All he had was an M1 and his 45, his 1911. And as that first attack was about to come in, he had his M1 and he laid his N-block clips out there for his M1, and he put his K-bar down like on one of the coral rocks. Well, he went back to Peleliu in the early 90s, and I swear to God, I saw this knife with my own 2 eyes. He brought back his K-bar that he left on the friggin' point in 1944. He brought it back home to San Antonio in the 1990s.
Amazing.
I swear to God, I saw it with my own eyes.
Wow.
Unbelievable. He was a hell of a guy.
Amazing.
Yeah, hell of a guy.
Wow.
That's a scary story. You can just picture yourself. It's presented quite well and described quite well. That's very scary.
Yeah.
Jeez,
It is.
Hey, boy,
Very near death.
That's quite amazing too. Jeez.
Yeah. So by morning on D+2, George Hunt's K Company still held the point, as we said. He had received replacements on D+1 and again in the morning on D+2, but still his company was absolutely shattered. PFCs were squad leaders, and what few NCOs were left were now platoon leaders. Of the original 235 men of K31 that landed on D-Day, plus replacements received during their ordeal at the point, only 78 remained, and their fight was far from finished. Relieved by another company, K31 got more replacements and was fed into the line yet again. At this time, they were looking straight at the hellish-looking landscape that would soon earn the name of Bloody Nose Ridge. Now, guys, we got to talk about this. And Dave, I know you want to mention the two leaders that we're about to talk about, which, of course, are General William Rupertus and Chesty Puller. By the end of D+1, the Marines had enlarged their foothold on Peleliu, no doubt. But most of the southern portion of the island was in their hands, and the beachhead stretched some 3,000 yards across the southwest corner of the island. The airfield had been captured, and the left flank had been reinforced with more men and equipment. However, the operation was well behind the timetable. The gains made were seen as significant success, so much so that General Geiger released the 81st Division to take Angara, which was probably a bit too early, and we'll get to that in a minute too. Casualties, as we said, had been absolutely horrendous, especially in the 1st Marines. Puller's regiment reported 500 casualties on D-Day and a further 600 on D+1. This is what we want to get into. Now, doctrine stated that losses in excess of 15% were enough to pull a unit off the line. Puller's 1st Marines had thus far suffered 33% casualties in 48 hours, and the worst was yet to come. I have in my notes here, and I know, and we're not going to pile on, but we need to discuss this because this is a significant question about, the whole ordeal at Peleliu. Puller deserves a great deal of the blame at this point, and it will get worse. He repeatedly threw his decimated units at the Japanese, who were entrenched, as we know, and reportedly berated his subordinates in the field when things fell short. But he's not the only one to blame, is he?
No, I mean, this could be an episode in itself. I'll talk about Puller and Rupertus in both episodes, so kind of spare it out, because at the very end we'll have our final thoughts in next episode. So that maybe gives a bit of an indication. Some of the viewers have to tune in for next week, so to speak. But right. So I think Puller, you got to remember, was a lot of, I think, and I'm trying to look at a historically objective view of Puller and Rupertus. As we know, Puller was most decorated Marine of all time. He was a legend, and we discussed him on Guadalcanal, and he's been discussed with Cape Gloucester. And I think unfairly, Puller has been a lot of the blame of Peleliu and the destruction of the 1st Marine Regiment is thrown straight directly on his shoulder, like all the blame or majority of the blame, which isn't correct. I don't know if it's been a revisionist over the years. I mean, Puller seems to be the fall guy. You got to remember, I don't know why people think Puller was acting out of character. In fact, Puller was not acting out of character. I mean, look at his service in the Banana Wars. Look at his service on Guadalcanal. Look at his service on Gloucester. He was not acting out of character. I mean, everyone was happy with the way he basically operated before because he got results. He achieved results, and everyone was happy with him. But the time here that he didn't achieve results, and he basically destroyed his regiment was destroyed, then the finger started pointing. Now, the Marine Corps doctrine and the Navy command decisions at the time, you got to remember, pushed him into that style of warfare in Peleliu. A lot of this information comes from my friend John Hoffman, who wrote a biography on Puller and Edson, and he was a Marine historian, retired. Basically, the doctrine is momentum. Once you hit the shore, keep pushing, keep hitting until you overrun the whole thing. Was he at fault at time? Yeah, he has to have fault and share some of the blame. I think one of his biggest failure, and I already brought it up, was his he failed to lodge a protest for Rupertus and push back.
Mm-hmm.
When Rupertus was saying, keep attacking. And we talk about Rupertus, we're talking about Puller, we're talking about another of these other veterans. As I read about Peleliu, especially these canal guys that started on the canal, might have earned a Navy Cross, Silver Star on the canal, rated as the top combat person in their either officer or listed in their company, but fell apart on Peleliu. They just broke apart. I think this was one too many. They pushed them too much. And I think Puller and some of the command was suffering from this. They were fatigued, they were tired, potentially post-traumatic stress, because you've got to remember, 4 months in that pressure cooker Guadalcanal, just to say, take the Japanese out. 4 months in that pressure cooker in those conditions, then weeks in Cape Gloucester under that conditions. No wonder guys were breaking up. I mean, I spent a week in the jungle one time and almost wrecked me. I can imagine spending 4 months under that condition. And then you got to throw in people trying to kill you, then diseases. So I think all that played in effect. But Puller, once again, and if he was pressured, one of his failings is as Hoffman says, that he didn't apply. If he was pressured or he didn't create that pressure, he didn't do anything to stop it. Because once again, if he did push back, like Bucky Harris potentially would have pushed back, tried to, what do you think the division commander would have done? It probably relieved him if he wasn't pushing forward. And then if he would have been relieved him, and then Puller's whole reputation would have been gone. And plus two, once again, I think I mentioned, he's trying to live up to his reputation. You know, I'm Chesty Puller. I get the job done. I'll keep pushing no matter what. No matter what.
Unfortunately, though, that I agree with you in some ways and I disagree in others, because while, you know, he certainly has a reputation, his reputation or his belief in trying to hold up his reputation costs a lot of guys their lives. And you know, I knew a lot of guys in the First Marines that were at Peleliu who cursed Chesty Puller's name to their dying day because they felt that he had wronged them in such a way. But as I started to say, and I wanted to get onto this, is that he wasn't the only one to blame, though. Rupertus, Bill, General Rupertus, and we mentioned this last week, you know, of all the battalion commanders and regimental commanders in the 1st Marine Division, all of whom were highly thought of, Rupertus was not exactly the most well-liked commanding officer. He was not the most well-liked commanding general. Most of the regimental and battalion commanders did not think well of him. And he is, you know, he makes this big blustery claim that's like, we're going to take this island in 3 or 4 days or whatever it was. And obviously that is not going to be the case here. He deserves a lot of this blame here. And Dave, you and I had talked about this via text over the last couple of weeks, is that, you know, mainly the majority of the blame for the high casualties here obviously fall on the Japanese for obvious reasons. But the pushing, Bill, this falls on Rupertus.
Yeah, I mean, he suffered from 2 major defects. The first one is in my reading of the history, almost like he didn't care about the casualties, about the percentage of, you know, effectiveness of the units that lost, you know, 30, 40, we'll talk about later, you know, 50% of their operating forces. And so that was defect number 1. Defect number 2, much like Holland Smith, he didn't think much of the Army. And he had the 81st Division in reserve. He kind of just sent off to, you know, take that other island, and you know, instead of reinforcing and relieving, no, we're going to do this. We're going to make Peleliu a complete Marine show. And so he kept pushing guys like Puller, who he knew would respond, and he was cursing them out and chewing them out. This is Chesty Puller. And he's chewing Chesty Puller out, trying to get him to move faster. And Chesty Puller doesn't push back. He's you know, Marine cheery eye, as we say in the Navy Marine Corps, right? He'll get it done. He'll do what he needs to do. And so, you know, there's not, and Puller's not the only regimental commander that he does this to. He does it to all of them. And I mentioned this in previous episodes, Seth. I knew Puller's son, who was a Vietnam combat wounded Marine in a wheelchair when I knew him, who sadly committed suicide. You know, imagine being Chesty Puller's son, and, you know, seeing what, you know, Puller did at Peleliu. Nothing you could ever do could live up to this reputation of your dad, and having to live with that, you know, I'm sure it affected his judgment in Vietnam, And he may have said, if I hadn't been trying to live up to my dad, I might not have been wounded. It's just a horrible story from beginning to end, Seth.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And Rupertus he's the one, like you were saying, Bill. He's the one that's constantly pushing, 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 pushing. And you mentioned it in the last episode, and I put it in our notes, is that Rupertus was not exactly the sharpest tool when it came to judgment of terrain and the situation as it lay in front of him. And this is a perfect example of that. He comes ashore on D+1, Rupertus does, and he felt like, for whatever reason, that the Japanese were about to fold, like a house of cards. Even though evidence pointed to the contrary. Evidence was saying that the Japanese most certainly are not about to fold. Yes, we've made some breakthroughs, but there is no evidence that says, we're about to blow a hole in the line and just completely roll them up. And when he makes this statement, Rupertus lands, as I said, on D+1, he makes the statement, so, we're on the verge of a breakthrough here. What you got to remember is that, and this goes back to my poor judgment of terrain, poor judgment of the situation, situational awareness, as you always say, Bill, is that the high ground had not even been assaulted yet. The Umurbrogol had not even been touched yet. And the fact that he's saying, oh, we're about to make a breakthrough, when it was pretty evident the vast majority of the Japanese defenders were in those series of ridges up there, it kind of defies the imagination as to why he even would have said that. He calls in, Rupertus does, he calls in reports from his regimental commanding officers, and he hears that the 5th Marines had suffered heavily, and the 7th had suffered as well, but both had acquired their objectives. And this factors right into Puller and our conversation that we just had. He was visibly annoyed. Rupertus was visibly annoyed at the 1st Marines, specifically the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, not necessarily by their casualty figures, as you said, Bill, but by their lack of ability to keep up with the planned timetable, his timetable that he had publicly said, we're going to get this done quick. We're going to get this done quick. It's going to be a short, tough quickie, blah, 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 all this other stuff. The Japanese are making him look like a fool. And you're talking about pride. We're talking about Chesty Puller's pride. This is Rupertus's pride saying, well, I said we were going to take this island in 4 days. And here we are. We're getting our asses handed to us by these Japanese who are tied in tighter than a tick inside this mountain. To your point, Bill, he reportedly yelled at Chesty Puller, quote, referring to the 2nd Battalion first, can't they move any faster? God damn it, Louis, you got to kick ass to get results. You know that, God damn it, unquote. And this is Rupertus yelling at Chesty Puller. And he's yelling at Chesty Puller because his 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, under the command of Colonel Russell Hansowitz, who was by far an outstanding company or regimental commander, or battalion commander, I'm sorry, was listening to Chesty Puller on the morning of D+2. Puller told Hansowitz, quote, I want that ridge before sundown, and I mean, God damn it, I want it. The ridge he is referring to, Bill, is the very first line of ridges in a series of ridges of what is called the Umurbrogol Mountain, Bloody Nose Ridge. This is Hill 200 that's being referred to on Marine maps. It was known to be a Japanese strong point of artillery, mortars, and machine guns. Hansowitz's 2-1 would be the first Marines to encounter the new Japanese tactics employed in the hinterland of Peleliu. Bill, we talked about this last week. The Japanese are no longer going to meet you at the water's edge and try and defeat the invasion. They're going to hold up on the inside, and the Marines are about to get a taste of that right here, aren't they?
Yeah, they're learning, and they adapt their tactics to what works. They realized, in Saipan that, we can make this really, really, really painful for the Americans. And in order to get the negotiating advantage, that's what they did. And they weren't trying to win per se. They were just trying to decimate and hope that the pain threshold would be passed and we'd say, okay, we've had enough.
Yeah, and to a point, obviously that doesn't happen, but the casualties that mount here in Peleliu are a clear example that their new defensive tactics are going to work. Now, as Hansowitz's 2-1's attack leads off, a Sherman and 2 LVTs, these are LVTAs, lead the assault with a battalion close behind, moving north quickly along a narrow, twisting road. The first 300 yards were easy. The Marines moved quickly. They only encountered sporadic small arms fire from above, keyword being above. All that changed as the all that changed rather as the lead vehicle reached the lower slopes of Hill 200. As the vehicles and men wheeled west to mount their assault on the hill, quote, as they always say, all hell broke loose. From seemingly every spot in the ridge above, fire absolutely poured down on the Marines. Small artillery pieces appeared suddenly. Bill, you talked about this last week, from caves that had, like, no kidding, steel doors in front of them that would open up. The artillery would pop out fire and then close behind steel doors. It's like something you see in a video game. Within seconds, all three of the Marine vehicles had been knocked out and the infantry was pinned down. This is the first time that the Marines reach this type of defense in the Umurbrogol, and it's the 1st Marines, the 2nd Battalion, 1st Russell Hansowitz's people here. And Dave, the Marines are going to fall back on a tried and true tactic, of which is to call in artillery and naval gunfire. But that is a tactic that, while it worked on Guadalcanal and it worked on Cape Gloucester, it's not going to work here at Peleliu, is it?
No, so well, a bit later it does come when they started bringing in direct fire, but right now the Japanese defenses, they're in those caves, they're well fortified, they're prepared for the tactics. I mean, one of the Japanese commanders I read, it almost goes back to when you go to Vietnam War, they're hugging them by the belt. He said that's how we can mitigate these American tactics. We can get them, bring them in, draw them in, and once we get them in close, then we can mitigate their supporting arms, because they got to get us in and fight us. So on this occasion, the battalion commander, they called in artillery fire and naval gunfire, and it started hitting some of the Japanese positions, and they started to effect to suppress the Japanese. The Marines began to work their way up the ridge, and the demo men and the corkscrew and blowtorch techniques we were talking about. That's just I don't know. Did you guys mention that in the other episodes?
We've done it in the past, yeah.
Corkscrew,
Well, in
blowtorch.
other events, yeah.
Well, it's really going to start to become prevalent now, especially when you go into Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and we start to see it here, that the Marines starting to adapt their techniques to take out these bunkers. So you got the corkscrew is the demolition teams and the bazookas and the BAR men basically hold them up, and the blowtorches, the flamethrowers, to go in and burn them out. So the demolition men started throwing, in this case, they started hurling the charges in any open hole they saw, to blow these Japanese out in their caves. But as the men gained the ground, the Japanese infantry started popping out of their holes. And then once again, this close hand-to-hand combat ensued. As we'll see throughout the next number of weeks, or probably next week and a few days, they going with slow and bloody. In 2-1, they moved up to Hill 200. However, despite the fight, they had secured the hill. But they were still taking fire from 200, because the Japanese were all around them and underneath them, so to speak. They say in Iwo Jima, the Japanese wasn't on the island, they were in the island. And this is a good example. They're in Peleliu. They wasn't on Peleliu at this stage. They're in Peleliu.
Exactly. I was going to say, and that's the key. Even when they take one hill, they're still surrounded by other hills. So it's not like, they're moving up in a steady line. They take one hill and they're taking fire from 3 sides, or even sometimes 4 sides, when they work themselves into a trap. And it's this infuriating, slow going, bloody, grueling process that seemingly doesn't gain much ground, throughout the entire process, through the entire weeks as they're going along. And the reason that we're pushing on this specifically is that the casualty situation here is starting to mount. There's a conversation between Hansowitz and Puller that is rather telling, and this is documented fact. Puller calls Hansowitz, this is after the attack on Hill 200, and he says, quote, "How are things going?" Hansowitz replied, quote, "Not too good. I lost a lot of men." "How many?" "I don't have a firm count yet, but I think a couple hundred," which was accurate. "How many Japs did you kill?" Hansowitz replies, "Maybe 50. Puller explodes. He says, "Jesus Christ, Hansowitz, what the hell are the American people going to think? You lost 200 fine young Marines and killed only 50? I'm putting you down for 500, unquote. Casualty figures stated that 2-1 had lost 429 men between D-Day and D+2. It wasn't until late on the 17th that Puller finally requested reinforcements. He was fully aware that the first Marines had taken a frightful beating, yet he never did, at least at this stage, admit that fact. And this is, and I had in the notes, why? With 2 question marks. Why isn't Puller admitting that his guys are just taking a beating up here? I mean, 429 casualties in 2 days is huge. I mean, that's huge. Why is he not? What is the theory here? Why is he not admitting the fact that he's getting his ass handed to him?
I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. You had hubris, you had pride, you had push to take the objective at any cost and keep pushing. That momentum, don't lose momentum, keep pushing. So, and once again, how much was communicated back to Puller? We don't know. It says here that there was information was coming back to him. I'd say it was, because Puller was probably right there, wasn't too far back, and once again, his leg probably kept him from actually going up there and surviving. So
Bill,
I think
Bill, you
go back to his also pride and hubris, and just what we said: keep pushing. I can do this.
Yeah, Dave, I don't deny that, but the success of that premise depends on the success on the battlefield. And to use the Navy expression, you can't push a rope. And a combat ineffective unit, is a combat ineffective unit. It doesn't matter how hard Chesapeake pushes, right? He's not going to get them to succeed. And if they don't succeed, this snowballs, it cascades, right? Now people do call into question the viability of the Marine Corps. And so, so he's working against his own purposes here. And so,
back themselves in the corner. Yeah,
absolutely, right.
Trying to get out of it.
So, yes, and so Rupertus as well. And so, and it's self-defeating, and I guess that's where I was going to go with that.
Remember, Rupertus, he'd have. I'm sorry, Seth, real quick. He was assistant division commander in Guadalcanal. He had obviously he was good friends with Vandegrift, so he had a success there. He had a fairly good performance in Cape Gloucester. So he had his car. Both of these guys are very ambitious. So he was potentially looking at the Commandant of the Marine Corps, being the next Commandant of the Marine Corps. So this was all about his reputation, all about his next job. So if he failed here, it's it for him. His whole career is gone. So once again, the guys at this rank, as you know, they're very ambitious, especially to reach at that top. And by the career officers.
I can understand that. I can understand that completely. But the point I'm trying to make here is their hubris, their ambition cost lives. And that's irreplaceable. I mean, you can't, that's inexcusable. I mean, if trying to fight for the survival of the Marine Corps, fine. But you're getting American boys killed because you got a thick head. And that's the point here,
And Seth, your man Eichelberger, I don't think would have done this. And so
my
point is that, I agree with Dave that ambition exists at these levels, but not with everybody, and it's not right. It is a sin.
It's not right at all. No.
Yeah, these guys, I haven't seen evidence of this kind of ambition in today's military to the extent where people are willing to trade lives, maybe because it would be more known what was happening now than it was then. There was no internet back then, and maybe you have more of an opportunity to shape the narrative before it reaches public perception. And so people were a little bit more forward-leaning with bad decisions then for their own gain. So this is really bad. I mean, we talked about Nimitz and bad decision to go to Peleliu in the first place, bad decisions at the division commander level, bad decisions at the regimental commander level, and it's the Marines who suffer. The Marines and corpsmen, Navy corpsmen who suffer.
Yeah.
Think about Puller real quick. He wasn't a butcher. Now you get some guys who said, "Oh, he's a butcher." He didn't care for his men. He had no respect for him. He did. In fact, Puller was a very individual type guy. I mean, he'd pull people aside, and he loved his enlisted Marines. But you say, well, that's contradictory. He would throw them into combat and to die. But Puller was so, I guess, hardcore and so professional. He's seen Marines. Yes, we're there, but we're there potentially to die, but we're going to need to do our job. They're expendable to fulfill the mission, just like himself was expendable to fulfill the mission, because he was always up front with his guys and taking the risk. But that whole mentality, I was taught in the Marine Corps, and the first thing, the mission comes first, the welfare of the troops second. You have to do that as a combat officer, because if you don't, you'll get nothing achieved if you put the welfare before the risk. But once again, I'm not trying to defend Puller. I'm just trying to look at it objectively of how he was thinking. But he's definitely not a butcher, and he didn't hate his men. Because remember, but you get other people who are I guess, senior commanders who you look back and go, well, this guy, he never did anything for the troops. He never liked the troops. He never did anything for the troops. But that's the type of person who's willing to throw lives away, and plus never share the same risk as these guys you're actually asking to put themselves in harm's way. But Puller, it was all in. He goes, we're all sharing the risk. We're doing it. We're all focused. He had tunnel, as we call it in my job as a policeman, years and years. He had tunnel vision. He had the red mist. He was focused on that. He wasn't looking at the side. He just focused tunnel vision.
Yeah,
lost situational awareness.
To be clear, we're not trying to crucify Puller. Because one of the remaining questions about Peleliu since then to now is what the hell happened? From a leader who was adored by his men in Chesty Puller to, guys who literally cursed his name till their dying day because of this event. There was a drastic change somewhere. Something happened. And I understand what you're saying about, the mission is paramount. That's obvious. That's why you're there. And Puller did love his men, no doubt. But something somewhere in there clicked somewhere. And
spoke about his brother. Just figure out his brother in Guam.
His brother had been killed on Guam, and apparently he did have that definitely affected him, and that may be part of it. I don't know. Yeah. Nobody will know. I guess is the point of what I'm trying to make. But the fact of the matter remains is that he keeps throwing his men in there, and admittedly, he's doing it under orders. He's not like he's just randomly throwing his people willy-nilly. He's not doing that. He's doing it under orders from Rupertus. And they're just getting chopped to pieces. And the difficult part about what we just talked about Hill 200 and Hansewitz's people finally taking the hill is that later on the morning of D+3, the Japanese attack and push Hansewitz's people right back off of that hill. So all those casualties and that time and that blood that was expended is a further waste. And that's going to continue with heartbreaking regularity throughout this entire campaign. And to be clear, it's important to note here that while Puller was he was being obstinate, and that's undeniable. He was under, and Bill, you can comment on this, he was under tremendous pressure from William Rupertus. Rupertus was just pouring it on him and talked to, in a scene that's all too familiar to Saipan, and we went on, that whole debacle many, many a time. Rupertus's XO calls Puller to verify that Puller understands the orders for the next day, which was to take Hills 200 and 210. Puller replied in the affirmative and says to Selden, quote, "We're going to take ground tomorrow without replacements, but we're going to add 10 to 15% to our casualties. Don't forget that," unquote. This is what Puller's telling them. So to your point, Dave, and again, it's massively confusing here because he reports casualties that aren't there. And by that I said, at D-Day, he said, "Oh, I don't know, we had like 40 casualties, and the casualties were actually 400. And then, and so he's not reporting accurate casualty figures, yet he is clearly at this stage, when he's on the radio with Selden, with Colonel Selden, Rupertus's XO, he's very clearly aware of the casualties and is aware of the situation. So, and that's what I was trying to get at, is that clearly something ain't right with Louis Puller at this point. Something's not right with him, either mentally or physically or both. And then again, Rupertus is just adding fuel to the fire. Bill, tell us about, this attack that Puller is going to lead again the following day, when he was assured that no replacements were to be found. However, there were replacements there available, were there not?
Well, yeah. I mean, we got to hold the Army division, if that's what you're talking about, in the 81st. And so, if we're willing to land them, and eventually, spoiler alert, we will, but only out of desperation when all this thing falls apart. Yeah. So, Hansenwitz's men took Hill 205 at little less. Puller Remember, he's limping. His leg is all swelled up. Aide in tow goes out on foot at that night and visits Hansowitz. The meeting went well, according to those there, but Puller did not relent, telling Hansowitz again, we press the attack tomorrow morning at 0800. There's no change in our orders. Full speed, use every man. It's important to note here that while Puller was clearly being obstinate, he was under tremendous pressure, as you said, right? This is where he says, we're going to add 10 to 15% to our casualties.
Right.
Puller was assured that no replacements were to be found. That statement was not true. With the 7th Marines, all of them now committed elsewhere, there's the 81st. Aguar had been captured already, and the 81st was cooling its heels. Rupertus was insistent that the fight on Peleliu would be a Marine Corps fight only. We talked about that. By the end of day 4, 1st Marines had lost an astonishing 1,500 men killed or wounded since D-Day. Reinforcements on day 4 with men from 2-7. Puller's units were somewhat stronger but severely depleted. He was aware, at least at this point, on how much his men had suffered, but he felt a breakthrough was close. He has Rupertus disease. He figured that the Japanese would crumble once more of the high ground, once the more the high ground had been captured. Hence, one of his reasons for the constant pressure. And so he keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And so the following day, another assault was launched, this time with a 30-minute prep bombardment by artillery and naval gunfire and air support. As soon as the Marines moved out at 0700, they found themselves in the same situation as before. Marines moving up came against steep cliffs riddled with caves and holes that seemingly all concealed Japanese infantry. As the riflemen closed the positions, they came under ferocious fire from above. You know, different verse, same as the first here, Seth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're just taking a pounding, and that's Puller again. He's pushing his men, and he's just they're not making any progress. And he's not the only one, too. By the way, just wait, because the Umurbrogol is going to eat every single Marine regiment in the 1st Division. But we're focusing on the 1st Marines here, and it's heartbreaking that no matter how much ground is occupied, they lose it almost within 24 hours or less sometimes throughout this entire fight. You know, again, we're going to talk about the terrain. Let's talk about the terrain of the Umurbrogol here. You know, the terrain, Dave, was incredibly rugged. We talked about, you know, some of the jungle swamp-like terrain on the southern end of Peleliu, the flat ground of the airfield. The Umurbrogol is, you can't even describe it without showing pictures and footage of it. It looks like something from, like, you know, another planet. I mean, that's what added to the horror of this entire fight, doesn't it? Isn't it?
Yeah, so I think in the pre-planning, or when it had a jungle vegetation on it, they thought it was a plateau. It was nice and, I wouldn't say flat, but smooth. And it wasn't until the naval gunfire and I think you guys talked about in the last episode that some of the vegetation started to go off and they could see it. And it was, I forgot what one Marine described it as. It was just jaggedy, rockety coral. Everything was coral. There was a lot of nooks and crannies in it and crevices. And it said it looked something out of hell, out of a Dante's Inferno, so to speak. And,
Yeah.
It's probably very nasty to fight in. It was nasty to fight in. Imagine the coral itself. So you got the coral fragmentation. The poor Marines are trying to crawl over it, doing low crawl, and they're cutting themselves up. And I don't know if you ever had coral cuts, been in the ocean, and that's nasty enough. But these guys are just like hitting the ground, running in it, falling down. That's why you see some of the photos. All their pants and clothes are ripped up. They've got coral cuts all over them. And then once a grenade hits it or a shell hits it, it goes into a lot of shrapnel. And plus, one Marine describes it being like hit with a sandblaster with the small Japanese grenades going off hitting that coral. So it's all amplified. And then the Japanese are in all of these tunnels that interconnect and pop up and around. And like I said before, they're designed to funnel these Marines in these kill zones to bring them in close, to suppress the artillery and mitigate the supporting arms they had with their close air support in the artillery. very well planned. So it's a nasty terrain to fight in. And then once again, then you got to go up and you got to go straight back down. And you can't tie in flanks because there's really no areas to tie your flanks in. The Japanese can do their great infiltration techniques around you. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
You
No,
can't you can't dig in. I mean, you just pile rocks in front of you. The
Yeah.
rocks don't stop those bullets very well. They just
You can't
you
dig in the
can
coral
move.
because there's hardly any topsoil. A lot of that
Right.
stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it shreds your uniforms. It's your boondockers get all cut up. I mean, it's like fighting in a parking lot. You can't, there's no place, there's no cover. There might be concealment, but with rocks piled in front of you, but there's no cover.
The
Absolutely.
Japanese are in their like little hidey holes and they could jump out and grab you, and that's why it's so much hand-to-hand combat. So, Seth, there's a part here I can read about how the fighting. You mean describe how the fighting was?
Yeah, it was
Um,
primal. It was primal.
yeah. And one Marine actually gave an example. He was on his way up the hill and he stopped and he kicked at something near his feet. The Marine stopped, stooped over, had a look, and he grabbed the it was a Japanese soldier. So he grabbed the Japanese and threw him off the cliff. And the Marines below the fight cheers and saw the Japanese fly end over the cliff. And the Japanese would be in these positions, and it's so steep in some of these cliffs, they could just roll the grenades down to the Marines. And then the Marines had to wait for the grenades to go off, just like we discussed. No cover, really. And the cover they did was, added to the effect of the shrapnel. And then they continued their attack up. So it was basically 2 steps up, 1 step back. It was very slow, very costly. But finally, one of the hills, 210, was taken by 21 and 27. Just like he's seen all throughout this battle, once you take it, the Japanese do vicious counterattacks to take it back. And then the Japanese artillery and the friendly fire artillery. That was another thing, because once again, these Japanese tactics of bringing these Marines and hugging a belt, so to speak, and some of the friendly fire would actually land on some of these Marines, as we'll see later too. But even all these casualties, Marine esprit de corps, the Marine grit, determination, and guts, they still held on. And a lot of these units would have broken up already. It's just amazing to me that you're going on with losing 30 to 40 to 50% casualties and you're still an effective unit. That just shows you the I wouldn't say fanaticism, but the training and the morale of these Marines to hold together and still fight on.
So, the fighting on the ridges, as we talked about, guys, it's back and forth, back and forth. Like you said it perfectly, Dave. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's consistent throughout the entire campaign. That the fighting on around the Umurbrogol is just hell on earth. And the experience of the 1st Marine Regiment is encapsulated, really, in my opinion, with the experience of one company specifically, and that being Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by a guy that I knew quite well, Everett P. Pope. I mentioned him at the very beginning. He also was a graduate of Baldwin College with Andy Haldane. He was classmates, class of 1941, who, of course, Haldane's K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th CO. On the morning of September the 19th, the 1st Marines again attacked the ridges. Progress that day was measured in yards, and barely that. After the normal 0800 assault ground to a halt, an order was passed at 1200 to C Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, to assault and seize Hill 100, which was a steep, somewhat isolated knob of coral that held a commanding view of the East Road near the 1st Battalion's right front. In command of C-11 was my old friend, Everett P. Pope. Captain Pope was a graduate, as I said, of Baldwin College. And like so many other old breed company commanders, he was a veteran of 2 campaigns. On Guadalcanal, he served as a machine gun platoon commander, and on Gloucester, he received command of C Company, which he, of course, obviously retained while on Peleliu. Now, like most rifle companies, guys, in the 1st Marines, Pope's C Company had been whittled down to less than 90 effectives from their original 235 by the 19th of September. This was 4 days after D-Day, or 4 days on the campaign. C Company should have been relieved, as should the entirety of the 1st Marines by this point, but that was not to be as yet. For the day's action, Pope and C Company were assigned to Hansewitz's 2-1. Their mission was to slip out ahead of the main force and take Hill 100. As we have seen already, this is not an easy task. You can say this is your mission. It's rather simple. Go accomplish it. But as we know, this is not an easy task. Hill 100, Bill, it lays almost kind of in the middle of everything, and you're going to hear a lot of familiar names. Tell us about some of these locations here.
Yeah, it's the rear of Five Sisters and to the left of the East Road. If Pope and his men could take Hill 100, it might provide an opening to hit the core of the Japanese positions in the Umurbrogol. Pope approached Hill 100 through a swamp, as if things aren't bad enough. And when they got near the hill, they received heavy machine gun fire. Forced to withdraw and regroup, Pope tried again, this time from a different approach. Supported by Sherman tanks, his men made their approach on the two enemy positions that initially held them up over a period of 2 hours. In the mess that followed, the Shermans were either destroyed or disabled, leaving the infantry to take the positions alone. Pope said, "We can either sit here and keep getting hit while we wait on more tanks, or we could take our chances and run across a few at a time." So what he did is crazy. He sent one squad at a time across the area, telling them to run at a full sprint across as fast as you can. Don't slow down until you get to the foot of the hill. This brazen move apparently surprised the Japanese enough that every single one of Pope's men made it across one squad at a time. Unscathed, pausing at the base of Hill 100, the Marines began the charge up the hill. Sliding to the right of the hill, Pope was able to shield some men from Japanese fire, but not enough. Even though they made it to the top of the hill with incredible speed, the action took a heavy toll, killing or wounding many of Pope's men, leaving a scant, you're going to get this number, 25 men at the top of Hill 100, Seth.
Yeah. And I mean, again, and this is why I chose, not just because I knew Everett Pope, but because of the fact that this action is a microcosm of the entire 1st Marine Regiment experience on Peleliu. And this is the easiest way to describe the absolute hellhole that these guys went through here. Once at the top of the hill, Pope realized that the maps that he had been given were wrong, deadly wrong. Hill 100 was not a single hill, but the nose of a long ridge that was dominated by a higher piece of ground just to the north. Who's on that higher piece of ground? The Japanese. Now exposed to fire from the high ground, Pope had a problem on his hands. Japanese machine gunners less than 50 yards away opened fire. Pope and his men were in the middle of a Japanese crossfire. I don't think we have a map of this exact action, Bill, but if you look at the area, and I'll pull up a general area map of Peleliu and I'll zoom in on this spot. It literally is surrounded on 3 sides by Japanese. As night began to fall, Pope realized that not only was he in a crossfire, but he was unable to contact battalion headquarters, nor could he get a hold of his mortars and machine guns. He and his men on top of the rise would be all alone all night long. Kind of sounds like George Hunt, but it ain't. It's just another repetition of the same story. In his journal, Ev Pope wrote, quote, "The line is flimsy as hell and it's getting dark. We have no wires and need grenades badly," unquote. Armed with rifles, 2 BARs, and a few dozen hand grenades and only 1 machine gun, Pope's men would have to be crafty to defend against the Japanese attack that was sure to come. And this is a famous story, but it's God's honest truth. He told his men to grab rocks, not to throw at the Japanese, but to trick them. He figured that if his guys threw enough rocks that the Japanese would duck thinking that they were grenades, and that would give the Marines just enough time to actually inflict casualties on the Japanese, not if they came, but when. Occupying a piece of ground the size of a tennis court, Pope's Marines tied in tight and waited. Once it was dark, no surprise here, the Japanese started coming. Initial Japanese attacks were in single or double teams of infiltrators who tried to eliminate individual Marine positions. All of the infiltrating attacks were repulsed. Shortly thereafter, the Japanese started sending teams of 20 or 30 in headlong attacks on Pope's perimeter. Now, you got to remember, when I show this map, you'll understand why they only sent 20 or 30 guys, because they're running damn near down a road. The majority of the enemy attacks came straight down the ridge right at Pope's front. He desperately needed artillery support, but couldn't get it, not only because he couldn't contact anybody, but because the Japanese were so damn close they couldn't drop any artillery in front of them for fear of hitting the Marines in their own positions. However, one mortar platoon near the foot of the ridge was able to provide some help. The mortarmen lobbed well over 1,000 rounds near Pope's perimeter throughout the night, offering some sort of assistance. But aside from the mortars, Pope was on his own. Not surprisingly. Go ahead.
That'd probably been 60 mm mortar, those.
It's
The number of them plus that close. Yeah.
Yeah, anything's better than what they got, which is Jack Squat at the top of this hill. And this is one of the legendary fights in Marine Corps history. The fighting, not surprisingly, as it has been shown throughout this event, gets down to hand. Two Japanese entered the position occupied by Lieutenant Francis Burke and Sergeant James McClarness. Burke took a bayonet through his leg while simultaneously beating his attacker senseless, while McClarness beat the other to death with his rifle. Together, the two Marines threw the Japanese over the cliff face. The fighting, Dave, you talked about the one Marine picking up the Japanese and throwing them over the cliff. This is what happens all night long to Everett Pope's guys. While the Marines did use the rocks to confuse the Japanese, by the morning, they were using the rocks to defend themselves. They were throwing rocks at the Japanese as they were attacking them. They were beating the Japanese with fists, e-tools, rocks, whatever they could find, because they were running out of ammunition. They're throwing grenade boxes at these guys, helmets, whatever they could find. It literally was something like you would see in a Viking battle. It was just absolute primal warfare at its absolute worst. The Marines continually threw their attackers over the cliff face throughout the night and into the morning. Japanese fire continually focused on the lone Marine machine gun, which was taken over by the assistant gunner when the original gunner was hit. The weapon continually had stoppages due to the overheating, but the gunner kept the weapon fire running as long as he could. By daylight, though, Dave, it's pretty clear that Pope's men are either going to need to be reinforced or have to be pulled out. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that in your Marine Corps history, you've been told about this fight at some point in your career.
Yes, I've learned about it. In fact, I was just thinking it was a very similar one. I was just wondering if it was an occurrence happened in Vietnam called Jimmy Howard and Howard's Hill, and he was a reconnaissance leader. His most heavily decorated platoon in Marine Corps history, and they were caught up on a little hill. And they were throwing hand grenades, throwing rocks in between. So I'm just wondering if Jimmy Howard picked that up. I have to go reread that. But yeah, this is very, very similar to both of these. But yeah, I've heard about this.
Yeah.
It's just amazing that the whole thing about the two, when they popped up in the Japanese machine guns, when the machine gun's 50 yards away and they're caught in a crossfire, I'm thinking 50 yards away from a machine gun is just unreal. It's just crazy. And then the whole thing about the guys are they're fighting hand to hand, and they're running out of ammunition, and yeah, it's just unreal. But yeah, I've definitely heard of this one. So
yeah, it's a hairy situation. It's a hairy situation. So of the 25 guys, Bill, that he brings to the top of the hill, Pope only counted 12 men still able to fight by morning. He finally does
communication.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was going to say he finally gets contact with the battalion headquarters. And he receives orders to withdraw, him and his 12 men, pretty much out of ammunition. Pope had only one round left in his 1911 pistol. As he said, they weren't going to take me alive. That's why he kept that one round. The Marines scrambled off the hill. As they did so, the Japanese swarmed the positions of C Company had held throughout the night. So what did that get us? What advantage was all of this? On the way down the hill, what was left of C Company came under fire, with Pope's radioman getting killed by his side as he talked on the radio. Running all the way down, the remnants of C Company found cover by a stone wall near the road below. As Pope caught his breath and looked at his men, he only had 9 men left. And of these 9 men, most were wounded, including Pope, who had shrapnel in his leg. So the remnants of C Company were pulling themselves together when at 16:30 they received an order to attack up a ravine, the same ridge they had just left. Only when regiment learned that Pope had a grand total of 15 men, 2 officers, that he was able to cobble together from all the stragglers That's all that was left of C Company. Was the order rescinded. Everett Pope would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership on the night of September 20th, 1944, Seth.
Absolutely legendary.
It's a good example
Absolutely
too
legendary.
about, it's just crazy, but it's a good example of how the lack of communication and just the fog of war and the just confusion about the number of men they thought he had.
Klaus was here today.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Big time. So shortly after Ev Pope's action, the main assault for the 1st Marines again kicks off, aiming at the same positions that Pope had held throughout that night. Puller poured everything he had left into this assault. He was still banking on the idea that the Japanese were close to breaking. I'm not sure why, but he was. The assault was prefaced by naval gunfire on the ridge that included one of Oldendorf's battle wagons throwing shells into the mix. The battalions of the 1st Marines were so decimated that even when they combined 2 battalions together, they did not have enough men to form one solid battalion. Nevertheless, the Marines gathered their gear and moved out. The men by now were a shell of themselves. Stumbling forward, their eyes were sunken, glazed over with the 2,000-yard stare, Bill, that you were talking about before. Almost resigned to their fate, they moved toward the objectives like a herd of zombies. There's a quote here that I have to read, and it's from a guy he was a private in the 1st Marines named Russell Davis. After all of this is finished, he writes, quote, "I picked up the rifle of a dead Marine and I went up the hill. I didn't worry about death anymore. I had resigned from the human race. I only wanted to be as far forward as any man when my turn came. As a fighting outfit, the 1st Marine Regiment was finished. We were no longer human beings. I fired at anything that moved in front of me, friend or foe. I had no friends. I just wanted to kill," unquote. The guys
Lost their humanity.
And that's what I was going to get to, Bill. And it's a perfect, thank you for saying that. And that's the thing, is that the fighting has worn down. And this goes back to what we were talking about Chesty Puller earlier. You know, something ain't right. Something has clicked. And the fighting has worn these guys down, not just in terms of casualties, obviously, but also in terms of just being able to function, not just as a human being, or not just as a Marine, but as a human being. These guys are barely able to function at this point. And unfortunately,
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Dave.
Now I'm saying you got to remember too, we talk about hardcore. This is the hardcore of the hardcore. These are the guys who still survive. These are the guys who miss being killed and wounded, but also these are the guys haven't cracked yet.
Yeah.
These are the hardcore guys. These are the guys, the most mentally toughest guys they've got left. You can see here.
Yeah.
Because most of the guys would have cracked.
And even these guys are starting to wilt. That's the point, is even these guys are starting to fold.
That's what I'm trying to say. This is the hardcore and they're just losing it. Yeah.
Yeah. And we made a big point in the first episode about Peleliu, talking about how the 1st Marine Division at that time in 1944 was regarded as the finest light infantry division on the planet Earth. And again, yeah, we're going to get argument on it, but suck it, because they were. But at this point, you're seeing that, even as you said, Dave, the hard of the hard are starting to break, because this is something that no American unit in either theater had faced to this point. Guadalcanal was one thing, Gloucester was another, Tarawa even was another thing, Anzio is one thing, Normandy is one thing. Nobody had faced anything like Peleliu to this point. Nobody. And even the best of the best are starting to fold like lawn chairs here. And the attack that Puller's men mount here, Bill, it's second verse same as the first. I mean, it nothing happens.
Yeah, it went virtually nowhere. Barely any ground was gained. Casualties continued to mount. Japanese Colonel Nakagawa radioed the higher headquarters that the Marines were again put to rout, receiving heavy losses, and he wasn't wrong. He was 100% right. Nakagawa and his subterranean defensive network had beaten down the 1st Marine Regiment. The attack made only one real gain, and that was not substantial. 2-7 struggled against the sheer cliffs and heavy fire, but by midday had gained the crest of a ridge. That's it, listed on the maps as Hill 260, just in front of the soon-to-be-named Death Valley. Later that afternoon, 2-1 and 1-1 were relieved by 1-7, 7th Regiment. They would soon be relieved altogether. On September 21st, General Geiger finally paid a visit to the front lines. Geiger had become dismayed at several things, that, not the least of which was the soaring casualty rate coming from the 1st Marines and the lack of progress. Rupertus had been informing Geiger that the Japanese were on the verge of breaking. He'd been saying that from the beginning. Casualties notwithstanding, and at any moment the battle would be over and won, Geiger says. Geiger sensed something was wrong now, and he wanted to see for himself what was really going on. He did not think very highly of Rupertus, and in some scholarship considered relieving Rupertus after D+2, but thought that relieving the division commander at the height of the fight would not be good for morale, even though morale was zero. Rupertus had been forthright regarding casualty figures, and Geiger knew it. Personally reviewing the casualty reports, Geiger was aghast at what he saw. Specifically, he was shocked at the 1st Marines and their casualties. He mentioned to Rupertus that they needed to be relieved, to which Rupertus seemingly ignored him. Not so subtle suggestion that General Geiger had given him. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Fields, Division Assistant Chief of Staff, agreed and told Rupertus that they needed to relieve the 1st Regiment, and they needed to relieve them with the 81st Division's 321st Regimental Combat Team, and should be sent to the front in their place. Almost unbelievably, Rupertus demurred, becoming highly agitated with the Corps commander that his division would finish this fight, Seth. He can't take, an order at this point. It's just like he deflects everything.
Yeah. And Dave, this goes back to your point earlier about pride, and it's the fateful pride. I mean, when I said this multiple times on this show that, when you got two guys telling you you're drunk, you need to hand over the car keys. And he's got, he's looking at casualty figures that are unmatched to this point in World War II for the Marine Corps. They really are, for a time period in which they're fighting. And this, he's saying, Geiger is saying, you need to pull these people out of here, and you need to put this Army Regimental Combat Team, which, by the way, is just sitting there doing jack squat and ready to go. You need to put them into the line like now. And Rupertus just continually blows that off.
Can I say something real quick on this?
Yeah, sure.
Well, Geiger, as you know, I think you guys might have mentioned it in episode 1. Geiger was there in the first few hours. He was on a beach, remember?
Right.
He visited, but he couldn't get to the 1st Marine. But throughout, this wasn't the only time he came after day 1. He would come a few times and visit the lines, and which Geiger would. I mean, he had a tendency, and they didn't want to lose their Corps commander. But correct me if I'm wrong, but Geiger, the whole plan was to have initially they didn't want the Rupertus says, no, I don't want the 321st. They wanted the 321st was offered as a reserve regiment. He goes, no, I'll just take, I think 37 is my division reserve.
Right.
But I think day 2, the 81st Division Commander Mueller come to, is it Wilkinson? Is that correct, Admiral? Is it Wilkinson? Who is the Amphibious Force Commander? He came to Wilkinson and said, look, we want to take Angar. And then they came to Geiger and they said, okay, we want to take Angar. And Geiger goes, no, hold on a minute. The situation is still in doubt. We haven't secured this island yet. Can I just have the 321st Reserve? And he was overruled by the Admiral. And that's why they committed the invasion of Angar. But then they had the 321st. But once again, we said that he kept pushing it back. And to give a little background on Rupertus too, I mean, I think I mentioned before, he was suffering too at the time because I don't know if we got it. It's in this one, but Bucky Harris, remember the regimental commander, might cover an episode where he comes on him and sees him crying in the command post. I think we'll cover it in the next episode a bit about his mental state at the time. I think this is a little bit later in the campaign, so I don't want to go too much into that. But yeah, once again, it's that pride and hubris. No, we can do it. We can do it. And another thing too, Geiger in his own memoirs and his own writing said he didn't want to relieve Rupertus too because
Right.
he didn't want to be the only division commander to be Marine division commander to be relieved at that stage and later on in the campaign.
Yeah.
But yeah, the
And
word wouldn't get back to Geiger, and Geiger has a bit to blame here because he is the division, or sorry, the corps
core
commander,
commander.
been more directive and pushed it more. But we don't know what was going on behind the scenes with these guys. So finally,
Yeah,
someone's made a decision.
I can't comment on the personal interaction between the two, but I can say that again, Rupertus is he's out of touch with reality here. I mean, the First Marines are shot literally. They're done. They're completely done.
Combat
Pulled out
ineffective.
day two. They should have been
Well,
pulled
yeah,
out when they were
agreed,
30%
100%,
casualties. Yeah.
100% agree. But by now, they are done. And like you just said, Bill, combat ineffective, and they are combat ineffective. And the fact that he continued to deny that, and even when you got your boss saying you need to get these guys out of here, he's making the suggestion. He's not saying I'm ordering you to get these guys out of here. He's leaving it in the hands of Rupertus, and he's saying you really need to get these guys out of here. And you got this 321st over here. And Rupertus continues to say, nah, we got this. That's a sign of being completely out of touch with reality. And because he knew how much these guys are suffering and that the Pullers unit was shot as a fighting unit. At this point, when Rupertus is like, he demurs on the suggestion that the 321st comes in, Geiger gets in a Jeep and he goes up to the front. He wants to go see Chesty Puller, and that's exactly what he does. Once at the First Marines headquarters, Geiger is absolutely shocked at the appearance of Chesty Puller. As you said, Dave, his leg was about double its normal size, causing Puller serious pain and fever. He's limping around, he's hobbling around like he's got one leg, grimacing in pain the entire time. He stands to greet Geiger. He's got no shirt on because it's 115 friggin' degrees in the shade out there. His eyes are sunken. He's absolutely smoked. He's absolutely exhausted. And Geiger, who's critically aware of the casualty status of Puller's regiment, asked Chesty Puller how he was doing. Puller replied they were fine. Geiger says, do you need reinforcements? And Puller replies, and I quote, we are doing fine with what we have. At that, Geiger shook Puller's hand and got back in his Jeep. He'd seen enough. He goes back to Rupertus's headquarters and tells him, quote, the First Marines are finished. The 321st is coming in, unquote. In other words, I gave you the option. You didn't take the option. Now I'm making the command call, and this is what's going to happen, whether you like it or not. And that is exactly what happens. Within 48 hours, the Army comes ashore.
Geiger, too. It obviously, with the casualty counts of the First Marines, it had a major impact on it. But I read in another account that hit the whole state of Puller, and that was probably one of the major catalysts. Once he seen Puller, and
Yes.
Puller was out of it, and he goes, man,
Yes.
if Chesty Puller's out of it, the hardest guy we know, that's it. It's no longer, they got to come out because they've lost their
100%.
command too. Yeah, so it just shows you how much he thought of Puller, and he's like, this is bad.
That conversation that he had when Puller says, "Oh no, we're doing fine," and Geiger's keenly aware of the casualties, that sealed the deal. That was like, nope, that's it. You're done. You're out.
Touch reality.
Yeah,
He's
completely.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bill, on September 22nd, a guy that we mentioned very early in this episode, and we're going to talk about him again next week, Captain Andy Haldane of K-35 is alerted that his company, along with the majority of the 5th Marines, would be moving back to the front lines. They did not know where on the island they were headed, but the ridges were the obvious spot at this point. At least that's what they thought. Obviously, there's an interlude in there, and we'll get to that next week. K-35 Sergeant Jim McHenry, another friend of mine, said, quote, I had been envying the 1st Marines because we had heard they were going back to Pavuvu. Then I saw the poor bastards, and I didn't envy them anymore, unquote.
Yeah.
Gene Sledge.
Gene Sledge. Yeah, he said of the 1st Marines, companies look like platoons look like squads. I saw a few officers. I couldn't help but wondering if the same fate awaited the 5th Marines on those awful ridges. So as Haldane's K Company moved on one side of the road, they passed Pope's C Company on the other side, and both of them, Bodwin. Haldane barely recognized his college classmate. He said, hey, Ev, is that really you? Pope's eyes were vacant and distant, and he snapped back to life. When he recognized his old buddy, he said, "Good to see you, Andy. Where are you headed?" Haldane replied, "Someplace near the northern tip of the island, I hear." Their conversation lasted only a few minutes longer, and Pope said, "Hope you make it. With luck, maybe we'll both be home for Thanksgiving or Christmas anyway." The two men stared at one another for a moment, and Haldane said, "See you stateside. If you get there before I do, tell everyone I said hello." So the first Marines spent 3 days on Purple Beach, mainly resting before they were shipped out. Getting aboard those LCVPs, they were brought out to ships that transported them back to Pavuvu. One Marine clambered aboard transport and was almost immediately asked by a sailor, I'm going to be embarrassed by the Navy here right now, "Hey, Marine, got any souvenirs to trade?" The Marine, wearing a tattered, blood-stained set of dungarees and wearing a 2-week beard, grabbed the seat of his pants and said, "Yeah, my ass, Swabby. That's my souvenir. I'm coming home with my ass. I ain't trading it to nobody." And that's the end of this bit of the story of Peleliu, Seth.
Yeah, and obviously that Marine that he's referring to was one from the 1st Marine Regiment, the shattered remnants of the 1st Marine Regiment.
That's
this
real
is
quick on that one. Sorry to show you another indication how much Puller was out of it. When they pulled them back on Purple Beach to have 3 days of rest, after the first day, Puller went around and told everyone, "All right, rest up, boys. We're going back in as soon as
Yeah.
we're rested." And it just shows you a bit how out of touch of reality they were. But luckily, that was overruled very quickly by the division staff officers. And no, you're not going back in.
Yeah,
And
I'm glad you said that, because that I'd forgotten to put that in the notes, and I'd forgotten to even mention that. But yeah, Fuller believed that they were going to be sent back to the front lines, and they were just back on the beach for a couple of days rest, even though he knew full well. So I mean, it was a mess. And the thing with Peleliu, and we've said this as we've gone back, with text messages over the last couple of weeks preparing for this episode, is that it's heartbreaking because it's the destruction of a Marine division, and it is the entire division by the end of the campaign, for little to no gain. And you see these stories, I talk about Everett Pope. That's why I wanted to highlight him, not just because he was a buddy, but because, that's a microcosm of the 1st Marines. You suffer this absolute bloodletting to take this hill. You take the hill. And then because of the casualties that you sustain, you can't hold the hill, and you're chased off the hill. And then your unit continually tries to take that hill again, and they just get beaten down day after day after day. And it's just one thing after the next, after the next, after the next. And Peleliu is one of the most frustrating campaigns of the entire Pacific War. And it doesn't seem like there's ever going to be an end in sight, but eventually, obviously, there is. Guys, this episode's run long, but it's been important. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap this sucker up?
no, I'm good. And thanks again for, hopefully I haven't talked too long, but I'm looking forward to next week and next episode. So yeah, it's a very important battle we need to discuss.
Yeah. Yeah. And we got a lot more
Nobody
to say.
from Alabama ever talks too long, Dave.
Well, Australia, yeah,
Or Australia. Yeah, exactly.
best of both worlds.
Well, it's been great having you back with us, Dave. We look forward to talking with you again next week. And with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in or watching our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this, if you're not already looking at it, look us up on YouTube. If you have a comment or a question, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. Also, another reminder for those who have never seen Dave Holland before, check out his YouTube channel called Guadalcanal Walking a Battlefield. It is a gold mine of Guadalcanal historic information. Dave personally takes you to the locations like no one else can. Dave, thank you again for being here, brother. It's always good to see you, and we will see you again next week.
Loved it. Thank you.
Yep. Bill, take us home.
And I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.